rashes along the boulders, along its banks. The river flows swiftly towards the sea. The current tugs at, then grabs and holds the leaves and logs, carrying them along for the swirling ride. Here and there a sportsman is seen in his kayak as he paddles with the flow. Gravity pulls the water, the river pulls the rest downwards. Suddenly, a silver missile breaks the surface and darts upstream. And then another and another. The shining salmon always swim against the stream. They must go upstream, and nothing will stop them from reaching their destination. The current of society's river is flowing fast and furious, pulling downward everything in its way. It would be so easy just to flow along with that current. But God calls us to swim against the flow. It will not be easy. We may be alone, but it will be right. Life throws nasties at us all the time. Some of our problems are quite huge, and they become quite like giants, and we must remove them from our lives permanently. I'm proposing that we kill these giants before they kill us. So what are giants? How does one kill a giant? Macquarie's dictionary defines a giant as a person or thing of unusually great size, endowment or importance. And today I want to use the definition, something of unusually great importance. But how do you deal with that when it's in opposition? Are giants real, or are they just larger than we think? If you're going to kill one, it may be difficult because they are bigger than you. Let's look at the story of the giant killer and just see how it's done. This story is naturally of David, and it's found in 1 Samuel 17. I'm going to synopsis the story, but if you want to read along with it, that's fine. David was the son of Jesse. He was the youngest of 8 sons. Jesse's 3 eldest sons were in the king's army, in King Saul's army. And David travelled backwards and forwards between working for Saul as a musician and helping his father with the sheep. It was said of him that he was a talented harp player. He was brave and strong and had good judgment. It was also said of him that the Lord was with him. One day Jesse sent some food with David to his brothers because he wanted news about them. When David arrived at the camp, the troops had already gone to the battlefield, so he followed. While he was looking for his brothers, he saw Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, come out from their ranks shouting challenges and insults at the Israelites. The Israelites were so frightened by this huge man and his threats that they just ran away. Goliath had been doing this for around about 40 days, and he had thoroughly demoralised the Israelites. David's response to Goliath's taunt is very interesting. He said, "Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" David heard from some of the soldiers that there was a reward for somebody who was able to kill this champion, and he was trying to find out a bit more information when his brothers saw him and tried to send him home. But King Saul heard of David's interest, and he sent for him. "Don't you worry about this giant," David said. "I'll go and fight him." David pointed out that he had killed lions and bears to protect his father's sheep, and he was not afraid to go after this Philistine. And after some further discussion, where a little bit of armour was tried on and various things happened, we find David facing Goliath with 5 stones, which he had just picked up out of the stream he'd crossed. He had his shepherd's staff and his sling. Just imagine for a moment how that must have looked. It really might have been even comical. David, unprotected, probably not much more than a teenager, facing off a hardened, battle-scarred champion who was 9 foot tall and in full armour. Does that seem like a fair fight? It was a custom in those days for only the champion of each side to fight, and that represented the rest of the army. Whoever won this fight would be the winning side, and this saved unnecessary loss on the winning team. The losers, of course, still had to run for their lives. As Goliath moved in closer, threatening to make David into mincemeat, David hurled a stone from his sling. It flew true and knocked the giant out cold. Since he had no sword with him, David used Goliath's own sword to kill him. Consequently, when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran for their lives, with the Israelites in hot pursuit. Now let's just unpack this story and figure out just what it is that we need to kill giants. What were David's skills and accomplishments up to this point? He had previously killed animals that had attacked his father's flock. He knew how to use a slingshot. He was not afraid, and he had God on his side. So was it a fair fight? Well, actually, it was not a fair fight because it was absolutely stacked against the Philistines. Goliath was fighting David's God. Did the stone that David hurled kill the giant? No. The stone disabled the giant and enabled him to be killed. A small thing in God's hand took out the champion. The stone of faith enabled the battle to be won. Just think about that. A small thing in God's hands won the battle. What a difference perspective makes. Most onlookers only saw a giant, the champion of the Philistines. David saw a mortal man defying God. Who is this pagan Philistine that he is allowed to defy God? Viewing impossible situations from God's point of view helps us to put gigantic problems into perspective. Do you ever hear talk like this around? What this church needs is a jolly good shake-up. How could this be allowed to happen? I can't believe our government officials. If I was there, wouldn't I just change things? Our schools are in such a bad shape, someone just ought to do something. Gripers, complainers, self-proclaimed prophets, and armchair cricket players abound. It's easy to analyse, criticise, scrutinise, and generally talk about the problems of the world, but we really need to do more than discuss this situation. We need people who will do something about it. It may only be small, but in God's hands, who knows what the outcome will be? But how do we know what to do? Remember the story of the talents in Luke? The first servant increased the talents given him 10 times, the second 5, and the third didn't even try. The lessons that we learn from this parable are that talents given are not equal. We all have differing abilities. They were given freely to the servants. Therefore, God prepares us for the task that he has in mind. We are only responsible to use what we have given. Let's just turn to Luke 19:26. Luke chapter 19 and verse 26. Luke chapter 19. This is at the end of the parable of the servants. Verse 26, yes, the king replied, but to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given. But from those who are unfaithful, even what little they have will be taken away. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. God is in the business of working through his people to accomplish seemingly impossible tasks. God shapes people with personality, characteristic, experience and training to prepare them just for his purpose. Usually, people have little idea what God really has in mind for them. So how do you recognise God's leading? Well, most often, it's actually when you look back to where you have come from that you can see God's hand in your life. I want to take a brief look at Nehemiah. You'll remember that the walls of Jerusalem remained in somewhat of a shambles for some 70 years after the completion of the rebuilding of the temple. God had already prepared and positioned Nehemiah beforehand. As the cupbearer of the Persian king Artaxerxes, he held a position of trust, and he had little power, but he had a great influence. He was a man of God, and after praying, he approached the king. He was allowed to leave his wealthy position and return to his fractured homeland. He took on the impossible task of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. I want to turn to Nehemiah chapter 6. Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 15 and 16. Verse 15, so on October 2, the wall was finally completed, just 52 days after we had begun. When our enemies and the surrounding nations heard about it, they were frightened and humiliated. They realised this work had been done with the help of our God. So what were the giants that Nehemiah had had to contend with? He had had constant threats from the heathen tribes nearby. Just turn to Nehemiah 4, verses 1 to 4, back to Nehemiah chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 1 reads, Sanballat was very angry when he learned we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they are doing? Do they think they can rebuild the wall in a day if they offer enough sacrifice? Look at those charred stones they are pulling out from the rubbish and using again." Tobiah the Amorite, who was standing beside him, remarked, "That stone wall would collapse even if a fox walked along the top of it." Then I prayed, "Hear us, O God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land." So despite the ridicule, despite the insults, Nehemiah finished the task the Lord had given him. He conquered his giants. From his example, we learn that the first step in rebuilding walls is to pray. People under God's direction can achieve the impossible. Nehemiah also shows us that there are two parts in service to God: talking with him and walking with him, praying and doing. Walk the talk. Another man who acted in faith was Gideon. Even though he thought he was a bit unworthy, I'd just like to turn to Judges 6. Judges chapter 6, verse 15. 6, 15 and 16. Actually, I'll start at verse 14. Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe, and I am the least in my own family." The Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." So Gideon's giant was the fear of what might happen. But the Lord instructed Gideon to destroy his father's altar to Baal. Gideon destroyed the altar and erected one to God in its place, if you remember that story. He took one of his father's bulls and then sacrificed it on the altar, as he'd been instructed. But because he was afraid, he did it at night. The attack on a god in this community was seen as an attack on the government, the local government, supporting that god. So he knew that if he'd been caught, he'd be in great trouble. But they did find out. And the townspeople wanted to kill Gideon, but his father defended him. In Judges 6, verse 30, just over the page, Judges 6 and verse 30, "Bring out your son," they shouted at Joash. "He must die for destroying the altar to Baal and cutting down the Asherah pole." But Joash shouted to the mob, "Why are you defending Baal? Will you argue his case? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If Baal truly is God, let him defend himself and destroy the one who knocked down his altar." So the fear of what might happen didn't deter Gideon. Have you been in this type of situation where you knew what was right, but the fear of what the possible outcome might be slowed you down? What did you do? Gideon acted in faith regardless of the possible consequence. And after this test, God gave Gideon much more responsibility. There's another story in Matthew 17 about faith. This is where the disciples were unable to cast out a demon. And they asked Jesus why this was. And the answer Jesus gave them was that their faith was too small. He said even if they'd had faith like a mustard seed, it would have been sufficient. So we find from this story that is the power of God plus faith that moves mountains. There is a great power even in little faith when we trust God's power to act. We may feel weak and powerless, but trusting in God's power produces the results. God told the Israelites that the promised land was rich and fertile. Not only that, he promised his bountiful land would be theirs. So scouts were sent out to check it out, to have a look at this land, and they reported back to Moses. They gave plenty of good reasons for entering the land. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. But 10 scouts did not like the giants that they found there. The people couldn't stop focusing on their fears. Talk of giants and fortified cities made it easy to forget God's help. Consequently, they roamed the wilderness for another 40 years before entering the promised land. Now, are we really any different? When facing tough decisions, do we tend to focus on the negatives, seeing only the giants and losing sight of the positives? Do potential difficulties blind you from God's power and his promise to guide you? Let's just turn now to John 6:16. John chapter 6:16. This is a story of a storm at sea with Jesus. Well, without Jesus initially. That evening, verse 16, that evening the disciples went down to the shore to wait for him, but as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed out across the lake towards Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them as they rowed, and the sea grew very rough. They were 3 to 4 miles out when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water towards the boat. They were terrified. But he called out to them, "I am here, don't be afraid." Then they were eager to let him in, and immediately the boat arrived at its destination. So in this story, the disciples were in a boat heading towards Capernaum without Jesus. The Sea of Galilee is 650 feet below sea level. It's about 150 feet deep, and it's surrounded by very steep hills. These physical features make it subject to sudden and violent windstorms that cause extremely high waves. This type of storm was quite common on the lake, but that didn't make it any less frightening. When Jesus came walking across the water some 3 to 4 miles from shore, they were terrified. They were thinking maybe they'd seen a ghost, which made the situation just worse. They didn't expect Jesus to come and they were not prepared for his help. But Jesus came and he said, "I am here. Do not be afraid." We often face spiritual and emotional storms and feel tossed about like a small boat on an ocean. In spite of the giants we are facing, he will give us peace in any storm. Faith is a mindset that expects God to act. When we act on this expectation, our faith overcomes our fears and the giants are cut down. When the disciples recognized Jesus, they were eager to let him into the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination. What a difference in their attitude, from fear to eagerness, with immediate results. Let Jesus get into your boat. We cannot always choose what happens to us, but we can choose our attitude towards the situation. The secret to a happy heart is filling our minds with thoughts that are true, pure, and lovely. Choose to dwell on the good things of life. This was Paul's secret when he faced imprisonment, and it can be ours as we struggle to face our daily living and face those giants. I'd like to share some Cherokee wisdom with you. One evening, an old Cherokee told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside every person. He said, "My son, there are two wolves inside you, and the battle is between these two wolves. One wolf is evil. It is anger, envy, jealousy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other wolf is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith." The grandson thought about this for a minute, then he said to his grandfather, "Which wolf wins?" The old Cherokee simply replied, "It's the one you feed." So it's the one you feed that wins. Look at your attitudes and look what you allow your mind to dwell on. It may be that you and I need to make some changes. When we bring problems to God in prayer, he often responds by putting his finger on our hearts. That is where the problem is. He shows us how to change and grow in our attitude so that we can change the problem. The answer often is not the one we were looking for, but is more effective in helping us trace God's hand in our life. God knows how to deal with our giants. The little girl enters the room with a long flowing gown trailing well behind the high-heeled shoes. The wide-brim hat rests precariously atop her head, tilted slightly to the right. And the long necklace swings like a pendulum as she walks. Following close behind is the man. His fingernails just peek out of the coat sleeves that are already pushed up 6 inches. With feet shuffling in double-sized boots, his unsteady gait belie his confident smile. Children playing at dressing up. They copy mum and dad. They've watched them walk. They've watched them dress. Role models. Role models, everybody has them. People we emulate. People who are our ideals. Unconsciously, perhaps we copy. We copy their actions. We accept their ideas. What sort of role model are you? Does your example make it easier for others to follow Jesus? Or would others end up confused with mixed messages? Do you help them destroy their giants? Or do you perhaps share a few of your own giants and discourage rather than encourage? When the giants of weariness and discouragement are looming large, take comfort from Hebrews 12. I'd like to turn to Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12, verse 12. Hebrews 12, verse 12. It's a very comforting text. Take a new grip with your tired hands. Stand firm on your shaky legs. Mark out a straight path for your feet. Then those who follow you, though they are weak and lame, will not stumble and fall, but will become strong. That's quite a good promise, that when you're really, really tired, that Jesus is still there for you. Although you may not feel strong enough to push on to victory, you will be able to achieve it as you follow Christ and draw on his strength to help those around you. We don't live with our own survival on our mind. Others follow our example. Don't be afraid to admit that you face giants in your life and help others by showing them how you deal with yours. Do you look for the good in others? Confronting the needs of others brings about various attitudes in us. I want to look at the story of the Good Samaritan and check out the attitudes of the key players. To the expert in religion law, the wounded man was merely a subject to discuss. Now, none of us would be guilty of talking about somebody and not helping them, would we? To the bandit, he was somebody to exploit. Well, sometimes we just don't have the time to get involved. Mind you, we'd like to, and it's the thought that counts, isn't it? To the innkeeper, he was a customer to serve for a fee. Now that's good business principles, wouldn't you say? But to the Samaritan, the wounded man was a human being worth being cared for and loved. And to Jesus, all of the above and all of us were worth dying for. How do our attitudes assist or hinder God's service and our treatment of others? Do we try to protect ourselves by not daring to step out of our comfort zones for fear the giants might be lurking just outside? We often build up events in our mind and panic over what might happen. Remember, God does not ask us to go where he has not already provided the means to help. Go where he leads, trusting him to provide the courage, confidence and resources at the right moment. Yes, God does use ordinary people. I've got a few on my list. Jacob was a deceiver. Joseph was a slave. Moses was a shepherd and a murderer. Gideon was just a farmer. Hannah was a homemaker. David, a shepherd boy and the youngest in his family. Ezra was a scribe. Esther was a slave girl. Mary, a peasant girl. Matthew, a tax collector, and Peter, a fisherman. Are not all these people very ordinary? Yet God had a purpose especially for them. But they did have one thing in common. And I believe it was a commitment to their God, 100% commitment. They had vastly different life experience, each met with their own particular brand of giant. Mothers, can you imagine giving your son to a priest to raise? Or how about being a pregnant teenager carrying an illegitimate child? God's work involves many individuals with a variety of gifts and abilities. There are no superstars here, only team members performing their unique roles. Their complete faith and trust in God enable them to deal effectively with any giants that came their way. Now, what about you? Will you, like the salmon, Swim upstream against the current, letting nothing stop you from reaching your destination? Do you have the stone of faith ready in your sling? Will you feed the right wolf by keeping a healthy attitude? Will you let Jesus into your boat? Will you become an excellent role model so that the young in faith can see what it's all about? Step out in faith. Remember, faith is a mindset that expects God to act. Viewing impossible situations from God's point of view helps us to put giant problems into perspective. He has already prepared you to be an effective giant killer. Will you let God help you? Our final hymn now is hymn number 547.